Well, good afternoon. We're going to make a start, and welcome to this CPA event, which is billed as Conversations with Parliamentarians, this one, Corruption in the Commonwealth. We're going to talk partly about corruption in the UK and partly about the Commonwealth, and obviously about the interface between the two. I've got two incredibly distinguished panellists. I should introduce myself, of course. I'm Robert Barrington, the Executive Director of Transparency International in the UK. Tim Daniel is a very distinguished lawyer who's dealt with many of the well-known asset recovery cases, and I'll be grilling him on that. Richard Bacon, MP, who has had a distinguished career. As I read his biography before coming, I noticed he's won loads of awards. So I won't list them, but he's an award winner, just so everybody knows. And he's on the Public Accounts Committee, which is partly what will inform our conversation. And I'm going to start off, Richard, if I may, with a question straight to you. The Public Accounts Committee, it of course, gets massive coverage here in the UK. But in one sense, one could see it as sort of a rather old-fashioned way of dealing with some of the issues that come up. And I wonder whether in the age of social media, particularly looking at the access that Commonwealth citizens now have to social media, whether it's something of a relic of the past, or whether you still think it has a function.
I don't think the fundamentals have changed just because there are new media around that weren't around before. And certainly social media does change things in some respects and can have very clear impacts. I mean, we've just seen the leader of the opposition elected as leader of the Labour Party to a very significant extent because of social media. And of the new people who joined the Labour Party to vote for him, 85% got all of their information from social media. So I'm not dissing social media as an important force. But in terms of the forensic scrutiny work that a parliamentary committee engaged in financial scrutiny or value for money scrutiny does, I don't think that social media is going necessarily to... It might help you communicate more with some of the people who've got some clues for you. But in terms of getting down and dirty and looking at the detail, for which you need the close cooperation of your Supreme Audit Institution, in the UK's case the National Audit Office, it's not obvious that social media would necessarily make a significant difference to the way you went about that. So for example, to take an example where something was wrong, the case of a whistleblower coming forward to a parliamentary committee and talking about, we had a case involving in fact, it's in the news this morning because I heard, I'm not sure which committee it was, but I heard MPs have been told that, I guess it was the Work and Pensions Committee, I think, has done an analysis of the work programme in this country, which is a welfare to work programme, costs £5 billion. It's been running for some years. We looked at it 2 or 3 years ago. It, frankly, was different in many ways, but also the rebadged attempt that had been going on for many, many years. We, some years ago, took evidence from an Australian chap who was a worldwide expert on welfare to work. And it turns out that it hasn't really done much better than a lot of other attempts in the past, but it also hasn't done much worse. And the reason is partly this is a very difficult area. But in one particular case, we had the head of internal audit at one of the providers whistleblow with information which they thought was significant and which did come to the attention of the committee, and we ended up having a witness hearing. But it caused us much. I personally thought he was a very credible witness, and there were others involved who were giving evidence whom I also thought was very credible, were very credible. But it created nearly as much heat as light because one of our members who'd been in the European Parliament, who'd served on the Budget Committee in the European Parliament, who knew a great deal about whistleblowers and who had had a huge amount of experience of dealing with whistleblowers, found the way that we were doing it and the degree of firm process and due process being applied was insufficient compared with what he'd been used to, and for him, his natural starting point was to dismiss it as hearsay without the firm, clear evidence of a proper audit trail and a much higher standard of what one might call proof. Obviously, it's not a judicial process, but the kind of material that you get when an auditor has been in and done some serious work and looked at all the numbers, looked at all the emails and got a thread and a trail. So, back to your question, social media doesn't really help with any of that and getting to that level of rigour. So it's another way of communicating and can be very helpful. But I think we get obsessed with every new type of media and think that it's going to change the world, and actually it's just another way of communicating.
And how do you think it's possible to for parliamentarians and Parliament to hold the executive to account in countries that where corruption is more prevalent?
Yeah, this is a very difficult question. I remember, I think, in this room meeting an MP from a Commonwealth country, I think 3 years ago, who was posing to me the difficulty that his committee faced because the government of his country was preventing parliamentary reports from being published by applying to the courts successfully for injunctions, which frankly left me gasping. The idea that the government of this country would apply to the courts, the idea that they would even think about doing it, applying to the courts for an injunction to prevent our committee publishing a report, let alone that the courts would entertain it, left my jaw somewhere down by my ankles. I mean, I really couldn't honestly believe it. There's not a lot I could say to him other than, I cannot help you. You have to fight for freedom. You have to fight for these standards yourself in your own country. It's not easy. It's not easy at all. And I think the other thing to bear in mind about it is it's not black or white. There is definitely a continuum, and you will have forgotten more about this at Transparency International than I know. So I'm not trying to make a point to teach you to suck eggs, but it seems to me, from my own limited experience, and I've travelled a bit and worked a little bit in the Commonwealth, and I visited Kenya a few years ago, and I remember about 10 years ago, 9 years ago I was there, and corruption was a very big issue, no question about it. Most of the government buildings had post boxes outside them where people could put in anonymous letters and do whistleblowing. It became almost the attempt to draw attention to it had become institutionalised. And now I learn from what we pulled off the web today that actually, and on Obama's recent visit, the problem is more ingrained, more endemic by quite a long way than it was 10 years ago. Or perhaps it's more visible than it was 10 years ago. I don't know how to calibrate that distinction. Making sure that you not only have the right standards on paper, but that you uphold them, that you adhere to them, is constant work. You can't assume that just because you've written a memo or written a strategy that the work is done. That's when the work begins, really.
And mentioning that Obama visit to Kenya, it was notable for us in TI that you had two G7 leaders in the same week, our Prime Minister in Singapore and President Obama in Kenya, making speeches about corruption, and that must be pretty much a first, I would say, in the history of TI, which is 20 years old, and very, very welcome. But one thing that obviously that raises is the question of whether the UK itself is really setting a good example, and whether, with regard to its relationships with Commonwealth governments, it's not only saying the right thing but doing the right thing. I'm, of course, have in mind that there have been a couple of interesting announcements from BIS in the last couple of weeks and the MOJ of dropping bits of legislation that have been promised, which actually send out apparently a very bad message to the rest of the world. Do you think we set a good example?
You're saying that we shouldn't just talk our talk, but perhaps walk our walk?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that would be a bit of a revolution, I suppose. I mean, I think it's been historically the case, I suspect, for most governments around the world, that they have a whole set of different things they're trying to do, some of which are contradictory, and they will very often reach a sort of, after all, you're trying to reconcile opposing and differing interests when you're running a government. You're trying to accomplish a load of different goals, many of which may appear, or in some cases actually be in tension with one another, and it's probably the natural refuge that the centre of gravity of any particular situation would tend you towards would be to try and please the audience you're in front of at any one moment, and then please a different audience at a different moment, and the consequence of that is you end up saying one thing and doing another. And this is the world. I think that's fairly normal. Have we been getting better or worse at that? Are we more or less perfidious than we were 10, 20, 50 years ago? I don't know. I do remember when Robin Cook became Foreign Secretary, there was a big emphasis on the ethical foreign policy. And it didn't last very long before it all seemed to come unstuck with all kinds of horrible contradictions. There's a new biography of Kissinger out at the moment by Niall Ferguson, Volume 1, and it's called Kissinger the Idealist. And he means idealist in the term of art, in the jargon sense of international relations, where you have idealists and you have realists. Not that he necessarily looks like a realist if you look at an idealist if you look at his whole career, but Niall Ferguson was making the point that certainly he was pushing a worldview of how he wanted the world to be rather than how the world is. I think probably most people who end up in positions of authority running governments, and this is a dreadful sweeping statement, but I think it's probably the case, more of them, especially when they then get exposed to international relations and international diplomacy and commercial relations internationally for the first time, they probably tend, because they didn't know much about it before they started doing it, they tend to take the world as they find it rather than as they hoped it would be necessarily. So I think there's much more of a natural bias towards the realist worldview than towards the idealist one. So it's always going to be a problem. I don't feel I know enough about the UK's activities internationally. I didn't notice the MOJ debate last week, but I don't feel I know enough about the UK's activities internationally to give an informed answer as to how we are compared with how we were a few years ago, and really, in an informed way, pass a judgment on whether we're better or worse. But now I do think that where people then tend to respond to pressure. So if there is more in any particular area, if enough people throw their toys out of the pram, there's likely to be more of a change than if they don't.
Thank you. Your mention of Henry Kissinger reminds me of the only vaguely amusing remark I've ever heard about corruption, which is from Henry Kissinger. And in this building, I feel wary about mentioning it, but just suffice it to say, it's it doesn't necessarily apply to this building. And he said that corrupt politicians make the other 10% look bad. Tim, I want to ask you now about the status of the UK. In most international league tables of corruption, including many of those produced by Transparency International, the UK and the Scandinavian countries and Singapore and New Zealand do quite well. And there's a bit of a backlash against those league tables from certain jurisdictions which say, well, hang on chaps, you've got the City of London and you've got mass money laundering and so on and so forth. Do you think there's a case that the UK, in becoming, and London in particular, in becoming a great global city, has also become the world's money laundering centre?
It's something, Robert, that we've been saying for a very long time, actually, that London is the money laundering capital of the world. And we have first-hand experience of that through the work that we've done over the years for Nigeria, which is a country which I've come to know very well in the last 40 years. And my specific anti-corruption work there really took on a completely new face when we were asked to assist the Nigerians with the recovery of the money stolen by Sani Abacha, who took, of course, about 5 billion in his 4.5 years in power. When we were first instructed, Nigeria issued the usual letters of request seeking assistance from the UK government, and that went to the Home Office as the appropriate authority, and those letters went to the Home Office. It wasn't long before we found ourselves before a junior minister at the Home Office, basically asking us all sorts of questions as to why it was wrong for the leader of Nigeria to have handled all these funds and to have put all this money into overseas bank accounts. They said that they couldn't see really that there had been any offence committed by him. They looked at the Nigerian statute book and there didn't seem to be any offence for this head of state taking his country's money. And so they wondered, whether the UK was really going to be in a position to help if there hadn't been a criminal offence committed. So we took a deep breath and an extremely dim view of this, because it came hard on the heels of the news that some 15 banks in the City of London had been questioned by I think it was then the Financial Services Authority, about the funds which had gone through the city, which I think totaled about $1.3 billion. And this money had gone through in 1998, which was the year that Abacha died. Admittedly, in those days, 1998 was very early days with the concept of money laundering. This was really quite a sort of a new idea, so I think the Financial Services Authority also thought it was rather new, and that it would be a bit hard on the chaps in the banks if they took any very severe action against them. The Proceeds of Crime Act, of course, haven't yet been promulgated, so maybe they found it difficult. But basically, there were, as I say, about 15 banks involved, and the FSA said, in effect, you've been extremely naughty, you mustn't do this again, and if you do, something worse will happen to you. The net result of all this was that the government really didn't give us any assistance at all on our Nigeria's request for mutual legal assistance. So we scratched our heads and thought, well, what do we do? Because that is the traditional way, government to government, to try and get the money back. So we hit upon the idea of launching Nigeria's own proceedings in the Chancery Division of the High Court as a civil action. And in point of fact, the disclosure requirements in a civil action are, well, they're very stringent. If you obtain an injunction freezing funds, there has to be a large measure of disclosure by the banks who are holding those funds. Although one doesn't have the clout, obviously, of being a police force or anything else, the civil courts are pretty strong in this. And so, without telling the Abacha family, we obtained orders from the High Court here, which required all the banks to hand over all the information that they had about Abacha accounts. By this time, we had about 120 defendants. A lot of them were overseas companies, the usual sort of tax haven sort of places.
Till I want to hurry you a bit with the story.
Sorry. And the upshot was that we got our orders, and this was part of a global campaign to get this money back. And to date, it's all actually just been settled, and about $3.5 billion have been recovered out of the $5 billion that were taken, and that is still the largest amount that has ever been recovered in an asset recovery action. But the significance of it, as far as the UK is concerned, was that about 2 years ago, the FSA or its successor published a further report on money laundering, and they said that it was extremely depressing, but the situation had not really changed since those Abacha disclosures. So in other words, money laundering was still going gaily on. The authorities were not damping down on the money launderers, and the banks, their customer relations managers, were still taking in a great deal of dirty money, and they were not being prosecuted for it. So, and I'm afraid that I think that situation continues to persist even today. So the UK is really not at the forefront of enforcers, shall we say, in this field. We had the Ibori case where the governor of Delta State in Nigeria put away for 13 years. Tremendous. We've now got coming up, according to Private Eye, the ex-oil minister, a lady who was the oil minister under Goodluck Jonathan's government, and it seems that she has been arrested and she has been charged, according to the National Crime Agency. She is being charged with money laundering offences, and about 25,000 has been frozen. But the reports say that basically whilst on her watch, something like 15 billion of oil money disappeared from the coffers of the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation and is still unaccounted for. And
you suspect some of that's in London?
I can't believe that it's not. I'm sure it is.
I mean, thinking of the Commonwealth in particular, some of the smaller Commonwealth members are the British Overseas Territories and Crown Dependencies.
Yep.
In a lot of the kind of transactions or money laundering processes that you're talking about, the Overseas Territories often seem implicated. Do you think that the UK government is strong enough in its dealings with the Overseas Territories on money laundering issues?
Well, it is trying to take action. Cameron has various G8 meetings drawn attention to this, and he has stated that firm action is being taken with the Overseas Territories and the Crown Dependencies, and they are being urged to put their houses in order and to get proper regulation in place. But one was slightly dismayed to read just in the last couple of weeks or so that the Cayman Islands, one of the sort of actions which Cameron wants to see taken is for there to be open registries so that beneficial ownership is disclosed, and the UK is taking steps to do that itself, and it'll be interesting to see what that reveals. Of course, in the Evening Standard today we see that Private Eye has found out a lot of information about these offshore companies owning a very great deal of property in London. But it'll be interesting to see whether the opening up of public registries will have an effect. But we read, as I say, that the Cayman Islands, which are asked to open up their books, in fact all these territories, mainly in the Caribbean, have been asked to put in place these registries. But the government is now backpedaling on that in the face of fierce resistance from the Cayman Islands, who say, not unreasonably, that they have in place a very strict regime, and that if anybody wants to know who the beneficial owner of a company is, they have only to ask the government. Now, when they say anyone, I think this is an accredited inquirer. In other words, I think it would have to be probably a request either channeled through the portal, certainly lawyers or accountants, and probably not journalists. But they say that they are very prepared to be perfectly open on this. Well, and as a result, the government has backed off from insisting that there should be a register, and I think Bermuda has also taken a stance against this. And one has a certain sympathy with what the islands are saying.
Why?
Well, because they say that they are capable of managing their own affairs, and they should be allowed to do that.
On this point, the Public Accounts Committee had a tax conference much earlier this year in the Guildhall, and people came from quite a lot of different European countries and jurisdictions, and I was nobbled by an official from the government of Jersey, and what became apparent to me, and they were particularly vexed in Jersey about this, but I think this is probably a point that is more broadly true, is that many of the jurisdictions that are either regarded as, quote, tax havens, or that simply have, in a variety of ways, a more favourable tax regime and lower headline tax rates, like Jersey, are extremely annoyed that they've gone through a whole series of hoops to raise their standards to an acceptable international level. And they point at the City of London, and this chap from Jersey did precisely this, and said, we've done all this, but you're letting all this happen in the City of London, and we have far higher standards than they do.
Yes, well, I think there's much in what he says. I mean, it is interesting, the effect that tough action in overseas territories can have on the economy of the country. We've been doing quite a lot of work for Turks and Caicos Islands, and we've recovered a lot of land, and we've recovered a lot of money. And this is as a result of the government expressing real political will in pursuing this with the support of the UK government. And as a result of this, the Turks and Caicos economy is now really buoyant. And the reason that it's buoyant is that investors have confidence in the TCI economy. They feel that it is well regulated and that it is a good place to invest. And I think that is a good example of how firm action can produce a very positive result.
And that was a jurisdiction where not that long ago HMG had to send in the commissioners and basically, because it was a colony, take it over and say you no longer govern yourselves, we do. And so that's an enormous improvement curve in a relatively short period of time.
But the inference of what you're saying is that there might be overseas territories or crown dependencies that haven't been cleaned up, and they're both not only not cleaned up, but they also don't have public registers of beneficial owners, and so are likely to be a hotbed of the kind of problem we're talking about.
Well, they say not. They say that they do have registers.
And by the way, no government admits to being corrupt, in my experience.
No. I mean, it's interesting. The case of Gaddafi's son, who purchased the mansion up in Hampstead, is often cited in this context, and that mansion was owned by a BVI company, and the court in England did send a request to the authorities in the BVI, and they got a response, and it told them that Saeed Gaddafi was the beneficial owner. So it can work, and one looks forward to it working more in the future.
Richard, just thinking of the relationship between the UK and the overseas territories, but also other Commonwealth countries, and I'm just drawn back to this question of would there be more sense of willingness to cooperate if the UK were setting a better example? And you're pointing to what the guy from Jersey said about the city is very interesting in that context. I mean, do you think there could be more done in the UK, and what kind of things would you suggest?
Well, your question started out by asking, would there be more cooperation? Do you mean more cooperation from other Commonwealth countries, or do you mean more cooperation from the Caribbean islands that we're talking about in the so-called tax havens?
Yeah, I'm trying not to focus too closely just on the Caribbean islands, because it's I don't want to be too down on them. But at the same time, they are an obvious focus of this discussion. But I'm thinking more broadly of Commonwealth countries, actually.
And I've got two thoughts. One, I lived in the Caribbean. I lived in the Cayman Islands in the summer of 1982. I hasten to add, not as a money launderer, but I had a clipboard. I was employed by the Government Water Project Office, knocking on doors, asking people how often they flushed their lavatory, to which sometimes, alarmingly often, the answer was that they didn't have one. And the project was trying to find out about water consumption on the islands to try and improve the infrastructure. And it's easy to forget that it wasn't that long ago. I mean, in 1966, before they changed the tax laws, there were cows walking through the middle of Georgetown in the Cayman, on Grand Cayman. And when I was living there, I spent about 3.5 months there. It already then had the highest standard of living in the Caribbean, the lowest rates of infant mortality, the highest standards of education, and so on. So, and a lot of that was brought about because on a very, very small island they had 500 banks. And I think I think in the same way that environmental protections and high standards of environmental cleanliness are something you see more, and empirically you see this if you look around the world, you see that more in rich countries than you do in poorer countries that simply often can't afford it. I think the same ought to be true, and very often is true, of the quality of regulation and financial regulation. We have a particular piece in London because over the last few years a combination of circumstances have happened that have made things much, much more toxic in some ways. You've got the end of the Cold War and suddenly a huge wall of money coming from the former Soviet Union as it privatized, and a very large number of people, a very small number of people got very rich very quickly. You've got the industrial changes in China, and you've had the failure of the euro, which means that many investors do not see the euro as a place they particularly want to put large volumes of assets. Switzerland is only so small or so big. The United States recently got to the point where its AAA rating was downgraded because there was a risk that it wouldn't pay back its debts. There aren't that many safe havens around the world where you can put money at scale where you know that it will be safe, where you've got a currency that's very internationally traded, where you know the courts are clean and you cannot buy an English judge. And that has created an enormous pressure on London. Add to all that all the extra immigration and the fact that we're building historically low numbers of dwellings, while the number of people in the country, even since 2004, has gone up by 4.5 to 5 million, and going back to the early 1970s, it's gone up by considerably more than that. And the pressures on the London property market have made it, the London property market in the last 20 years has become its own separate money laundering device, I think, separate from almost everything else. So there are I don't want to make an excuse about it, but there are slightly unique circumstances in this particular space right now at this particular time. Would better cooperation achieve better results? Yes, it probably would. I mean, there is a lot of cooperation already. If you look at the way the HMRC talks to different tax jurisdictions around the world, we've just seen the introduction of automatic exchange of information. The OECD, when Margaret Hodge, who was the chairman of our committee in the last Parliament, went to the OECD to talk about the tax transparency and greater understanding of the way in which multinational corporations who are doing activities in many different countries get out of paying tax in the jurisdiction from which the revenue is raised. They said, we've been talking about this for 30 years. You're the first politician we've ever met. They said to Margaret, they said, you are a tax rock star. And she managed to get from Tax Magazine Tax Prat of the Year in the same 12 months. So, there are different views on it, but it's not going to be an easy conversation because lots of different countries are looking for international investment, they're looking for competitive advantage, they're trying to attract in industries. And there are always going to be, to some extent, countries playing off against each other to attract these big investments. But I do agree with the fundamental point that if you have a strong, robust set of regulations that are seen to work, that are clean, that are relatively simple and straightforward, that is the best, and that are stable, that's the best possible environment for attracting investment long term and for stable growth, and for making sure that taxpayers' money, which is what we spend most of our time looking at on the Public Accounts Committee, gets well used, and that in countries around the world, people feel that when they pay their taxes, that they get something for them.
Okay. But coming back to your question, Robert, I mean, one is again rather dismayed to see that in one of the responses which is given as to why it is, how it can be that all these offshore companies are buying all this property and huge amounts of money flooding into the country, and what is being done to check what this money is, where it comes from. And the stock response at the moment seems to be, well, that's the job of the private sector. It's the banks and the estate agents who should be carrying out these checks. And how many suspicious activity reports have been filed by estate agents in the last year?
160, I think.
Yes, exactly.
Out of 350,000.
Yeah. And they are absolutely at the front line. And is any action taken against these estate agents? Nothing that one has seen at all. I mean, some action has been mooted against the banks, but I don't think that any bank has yet been prosecuted for failing to make proper inquiries about their customers in relation to the source of the funds that are being invested. I mean, the authorities seem to think that the reputational risk to the banks is such that they wouldn't dare not do it. But actually, it doesn't seem that is a sufficient deterrent.
Thank you. I'm going to ask in a moment for questions from the floor, so please do be thinking of questions. But I'm just going to toss an easy one finally to Richard. In most of the global surveys on bribery, there's a depressingly large number of citizens around the world who feel they need to pay bribes in order to carry on with their daily lives. And it clearly has a devastating impact on people's daily lives, particularly the poorest. And the UK, to its great credit, passed the Bribery Act in 2010. But there are now moves from BIS to water it down. Are you with or against BIS and watering down the Bribery Act?
I am not across the details of what BIS has proposed, so I would give an ignorant answer if I tried to. But I do think that what you've described about the way it eats into people's lives is extremely insidious, and it gets to the point where it's almost the quintessential vicious circle. It gets very quickly to the point where I've seen this in East Africa, in certain countries, where just for the light they ignore the lights just to get past the traffic policeman who's waving the traffic on, takes no notice of the traffic and the traffic lights and stands in the middle of the road. Just to get your car to the front of the queue and turn right, you have to flick out some money to pay the traffic policeman. I mean, it's surreal. And the more of that you have, the more corroded the whole society becomes. And you do need people in country to stand up and say, up with this we will not put. It can't really be forced on any jurisdiction from outside, I don't think. I mean, yes, you can have conversations about aid budgets and aid programs and all the rest of it, many of which have themselves, of course, been at times withdrawn because of very obvious corruption. The examples of the phantom civil servants in Kenya who existed on paper and were drawing salaries but didn't really exist. And things like that. But at the end of the day, the impetus for changing it has to come from the country itself. And I'm sorry I can't answer your question about this. I wish I were more across it.
Right, thank you. I'm going to ask questions from the floor. We are videoing today's session, so there'll be a microphone. If you don't want to appear on video, then it's best if you ask your question afterwards, discreetly, rather than in front of the camera. Any questions? That's the one here.
So you talked a lot about housing, and specifically housing in London being used as investment, possibly for money laundering. And I just wondered what you both think about the government introducing regulation to try and control that. Whether you think that is something that should happen, or whether you feel that it is something that the market can still do.
Thank you. Could you tell us where you're from and your name?
I'm Georgina and I work in the accommodation office.
Thank you.
I'll go first if you want. I don't think the premise of your question is that we have a housing market, and if we did, the supply of housing would rise to meet the demand for housing. We'd have enough places for everyone to live, for everyone to have somewhere to live. Instead of which, we have people who don't have anywhere to live, who I met people in my constituency during the election, not in London, but who their 34-year-old son is still living at home because they can't afford anywhere to live. And people who leave university and come to London now, it is a quantum leap more difficult to think about finding somewhere to live, to let alone buy, but perhaps somewhere to rent than it used to be, and is much, much more expensive and consumes a much greater proportion of income. And in that context, to see large skyscrapers going up that are sold off plan in the Far East and then left empty, and then sold virgin, I forget what the technical term is, I don't think it's virgin, but you know what I mean, unused, they're sold as unused apartments 2 or 3 years later for an equity uplift. I think those are the sort of circumstances that would drive normal, rational people to apoplexy. Those are the sorts of circumstances that help breed social unrest, if you ask me. I think it's an outrage. It's an absolute outrage. And yes, I think there's probably quite a lot that we could do about it in terms of the way you tax those properties through council tax, what adjustments you make to the various kinds of taxation to which property is subject. And I don't think we've done enough yet.
Yes, I think a tax on empty properties is a very good idea, and council tax could be deployed to do that. But there's also the planning question. Permission is given to put up these great skyscrapers, and there does not seem to be nearly enough of a social housing element when that permission is given. And so many of these developments seem to have really minimal, just token social housing. And I think those regulations should be much more stringently enforced.
Well, I partially agree with you. I was at MIPIM this morning, which is the big property and investment trade fair at Kensington Olympia. And there were some demonstrators outside demonstrating precisely about the lack of social housing in new developments in London. Of course, there isn't enough social housing, although if you think about the word affordable for a moment, you will see that the very application or use of the word affordable is itself deeply laden, it's deeply tendentious. You're all sitting down, no one talks about affordable chairs. You've all got shoes, no one talks about affordable shoes. We don't think we need a national shoe service. Nobody says we need a new government programme called Help to Sit to make sure everyone's got somewhere to sit down, because otherwise there won't be enough chairs. And the reason is because the supply of chairs and the supply of shoes rises to meet the demand for shoes and for chairs. And that's what we need to have in housing, which is why, because I hate going to any meeting where I don't mention the Self-Build and Custom House Building Act, which I got from Parliament at the end of the last Parliament, which is why I produced a piece of legislation that got through that creates opportunities for ordinary people to get a piece of land and to build, or groups of people to get a piece of land and build a dwelling. At the moment, in the way that the land supply operates in this country, we have what is essentially a cartel, beautifully described by Adam Smith in Part of the Wealth of Nations, where too much capital is allocated permanently to produce too little output at the other end, because you can get what an economist would call supernormal profits, but over a long run period. And that's what has to change. You have to have more ability to enter, then we need to lower the barriers of entry. We need to make land much more widely available. There are, of course, particular problems in very big cities, world cities like London, which is again an exception. But you go to Berlin, and in the last 20 years, 5,000 dwellings have been built by what are called Baugruppen, building groups, in 300 different groups, where largely they are housing cooperatives. Some of them are for private purchase, some of them are for affordable rent, where the land acquisition, the site identification, the people, the finance are brought together by an architect, and they do it themselves. Now, Berlin was in a slightly different position because it's a very geographically spread out city with less than half the population of London, and huge areas in the east particularly that were basically bomb sites that had been grown over with a few trees. And the people said, we're not having somebody building a skyscraper there, thank you very much. We're going to have, for a corporate office, we're going to have apartments, we're going to live there, we're going to use the land for us. And they got the support of the Berlin Senate, of the local authority, to do that. But this movement, if you look in the Netherlands, in Sweden, in southern Germany, there are lots of different places where this sort of thing is happening. There are unique circumstances, and London is one of the exceptions. I mean, it's the biggest city in Europe, and it has a very special combination of circumstances. But do we need to break open the cartel? Yes, I think we do.
Thank you. There's a question here at the front and then one at the back. And if you could say where you're from and your name.
Mushtaq Mashari, I'm coordinator of APPG on Third World Solidarity, which work for peace and tolerance and human rights. I just wanted to ask a question in response to one of your comments. You said the public has to stand up, but I've seen in most of the third world countries, the public has accepted this corruption. And actually, I remember one of the former Prime Minister in Pakistan saying that we have become corrupt as a society.
Yes.
And everybody, when he leaves home, is ready to bribe somebody to take it. And follow-up is, and the institutions do legalize the corruption by giving funds to parliamentarians, by giving land to the ex-judges and the secretary. So you reach to a certain level and you are obliged to be given a plot, and every army officer, when he is in one town, he is given a plot to build a home. He moves on as a next posting and he sells it and get another one. So legalization through institutional, what do you think and how?
Well, I think that's why it can be so insidious. If it becomes completely culturally accepted, then you're already in a very difficult position. Yes, there's no doubt about that. I don't think there's once it gets that deep, there's not a simple or quick answer. And you know, we have. I can't remember if it was in Yes Minister or elsewhere, but I remember someone once describing honours system as being much cheaper than defence contracts, which is what they did in the US. You just give somebody a knighthood, and you will have noticed quite a few people over the years when they retire from public life, they go off and they become governor of Bermuda or governor of the Cayman Islands or wherever it is. Which do you call that corruption, or do you call that? I mean, arguably, most of the people who end up doing that are probably reasonably fitted for it. They've had the kind of background that probably puts them in the right position to do it, but it can be still a very cosy number. I was told today, I was talking to a Labour colleague, who was talking about a trade union, the Rail and Maritime Union, which merged with one of the other much bigger rail unions, the National Union of Railways. And one of the things they insisted upon in the merger was that the smaller union, the Rail and Maritime Union, kept its branch secretary and its branch office in one of the Caribbean islands. Quite why it had one there wasn't clear, but it was a very nice sinecure for somebody. And I don't know how it had in the first place been created. I suppose you could call those sorts of things corrupt or questionable, but I don't know the circumstances in that case, so maybe it was a legitimate reason for doing it. But the point you make about the whole society, once it gets to that point, it does make it much, much more difficult to undo it. And it's a striking fact that the countries that have the greatest degree of visibility and transparency, and that do best in the indices of human development, such as Norway and Sweden and Finland and so on, it's very often the Scandinavian. In fact, it's very often Scandinavian. It's very often monarchies. If you look at the Netherlands and to some extent the UK, since we're a pretty clean country, I think broadly speaking, they tend to be ones where I think transparency and visibility is very, very closely correlated with success as a society overall. And I do think sunshine is a very good disinfectant.
Richard, you said a couple of things there I want to pursue before we go to the next question. That Britain's a pretty clean country, but also you were agreeing, I think, about the dangers of sort of institutionalised corruption. I want to ask you a bit about the House of Lords. Within the corruption literature in the UK, there's quite a strong theme that party donors are basically able to buy seats in the House of Lords, and it's more or less the only legislature in the world where you can buy your seat quite openly in Parliament, and that is seen as fundamentally corrupt. And yet, we're also saying that it's incumbent on the UK to try and set a good example to other countries if we're going to try and look for general improvement. What do you think of the House of Lords?
Well, I'm not in the House of Lords, I'm in the House of Commons, so I know what I read in the newspapers, and I do have a bit to do with them occasionally. If I'm on a bill, which I try to avoid because I think we have far too many laws, apart of course from the Self-Build and Custom House Building Act. But generally, I don't have a huge amount to do with the House of Lords, but I don't think they're the only country in the world where you can more or less openly, and perhaps it's more in a more closed way in some other countries, buy a seat in the upper house. I mean, there was
But you do think it happens?
Well, de facto, in some shape or form, it appears to be visibly happening. I was in Kyrgyzstan some years ago, and I hadn't understood why all the big business moguls who owned all the big corporate entities in the country, and it's quite a poor country, but still they've got concentrated wealth and big ownership, were members of Parliament. And then it dawned on me, somebody explained to me, it's because if you're a member of Parliament, you get immunity from prosecution, at least you do there, as indeed you do in some continental countries, in Italy and Germany. And you can't be arrested in Germany without a motion of both houses of Parliament. So, and I suspect that we've seen it going on for such a long time now, that people make donations, or they find out which charity's in favour with the Prime Minister's wife, and next thing you know, a few years later, they pop up in the House of Lords. And there's no direct connect or no read across that you can show with a thread. But I think the House of Lords is getting to the point now where, unless they do something, it'll be done to them, and it'll be done for the wrong reasons on the wrong terms at the wrong time. It's getting a little bit ridiculous, and I personally favour a system where you have a revising chamber that doesn't have more. I haven't got a huge objection, except that it would have consequences that I would disagree with. If I thought that making the House of Lords elected and doing it on a different basis would make the executive, the government, more accountable and strengthen Parliament vis-a-vis the executive, I would be in favour of it. But I suspect what would happen if we went down that route is that the government would take much more strident steps than they do at the moment to control the House of Lords, like they do with the House of Commons, because it's essential for their own survival, at which point the Lords would become more like the Commons, at which point the merit of having a second chamber would become diminished. And I favour strongly having a revising chamber. So I'd rather keep the balance in terms of the powers as it is. I think we need a slimmed down House of Lords. They found a way to start doing retirements. I think they need to accelerate some of that. Yeah.
As I think I'm probably the only member of the House of Lords here today, and I think you're right about people paying to get into the Lords, but it is not as common as it might appear on the surface. A lot of people actually have served their parties in other ways, and they are brought in, and it's really to strengthen the party that people are brought in. I mean, all the new peers, most of them have been brought in by the Tories to strengthen the Tories. See, there are a lot of Liberal Democrats, and the Tories want to strengthen their party. But as far as the numbers are concerned, it's getting ridiculous. I mean, there's no way a House of Lords can be efficient with over 800 members. And how we go about that, every time we try it, something is tried, it fails. There is no agreement on it. But you know, many years ago, last century, Bagehot said, you look at your first chamber, and then you design your second chamber. I think you should look at yourselves, the Commons, to see where are the deficiencies and what kind of second chamber this country needs. And that's the way I would go.
Thank you. Could you remind us of your name?
Oh,
Baroness Fletcher.
I'm Baroness Flather.
Thank you. It's just for the benefit of the video. There was a question here.
Yes, thank you. You got me on that. Robert, you rather stole my question, but I'll try and extend it. My name
Just take the microphone.
I can. Fantastic. So I'm Naomi from the All Party Group on Anti-Corruption. And I suppose my question really is about how, just kind of want you to discuss really, how we are in the UK and also other Commonwealth countries, how we regulate or police like lobbying as well. So not just restrict to the House of Lords and how influence is brought there, but more broadly through how ministers and government departments are influenced. For example, I'm very happy to brief you on what's going on with the Bribery Act guidance and BIS, and that is a case in point really where we've really quite struggled to understand the reasons why they're looking into the guidance on hospitality and facilitation payments. We've not had very good responses from questions that members of the group have put down. And so we've been stonewalled consistently there to find out what's going on. So that also gives us concerns about why this is happening. And I think this is common. I mean, this happens in the UK. How do we go about doing that better? The lobbying register was a bit of a false promise. In the end, quite a toothless piece of work. So again, in this year, which is going to be very big for anti-corruption, the Prime Minister is going to have a summit in the early spring and summer. Next year, again, if we have to get our own house in order, this is a particular area of concern as well, which I don't think is being paid attention to by the government at the moment, just because they feel it's been put to bed with the lobbying register, as I said. So, not really a question, but
Thanks. Comments are welcome too.
Yeah.
Richard, are you often lobbied?
Yes and no, it depends what you mean by lobby. I had a phone call once from somebody who introduced himself and said, I am a lobbyist. And I said, that's so refreshing to hear somebody actually say that. And
he was very young, obviously.
And, no, he wasn't. He was very experienced. And he came straight out with what he wanted. Very often, and when I was a journalist, I wrote a big feature article for Euromoney about lobbying in the European Union and in the European Commission, where they could not function without lobbyists because they're so small relative to the size of what they're doing. And I remember interviewing a lawyer, an American lawyer, head of an American law firm in Brussels, who said not only could they not function without us, but you have to work very hard for a very long period of time to get to know the right people. And you find a fonctionnaire suddenly presented with a big problem, and if you are in the right place at the right time and well informed, you can say, well, here's some text that might work, and you suddenly find your own words verbatim turning up in a draft directive. And that lawyer will be doing a good job for his clients. I'm not sure there's anything sort of necessarily particularly evil about that. I do like the American system where, for example, in the Securities and Exchange Commission, there's a very open register of who's seen what, who's seen whom about what when, and certainly in relation to whom, in relation to who permanent secretaries and other officials meet, it's now much more open, I think, than it used to be. In terms of the lobbying register, the thing that caught my eye about it most was the way that charities were trying to make themselves exempt, even though some of them were engaging in activities which manifestly by any standards would amount to, quote, lobbying, sometimes with a very clear view and agenda. I'm not saying there's anything right or wrong about that, they would have an agenda. Sometimes in cases where it would be a political agenda that might have actually crossed over the boundaries of what they were supposed to be doing according to the terms of the Charities Act and the role of the Charity Commissioner in supervising them, but somehow wished to be exempt from others. And at the same time, you have this bigger problem that anybody ought to be able to come and see his or her member of parliament and tell them their views at any time. And I have constituents coming to see me in my surgery purely to lobby. We've got a lobby coming up soon on trade. I've got some trade unionists coming to see me. They're concerned about some changes to trade union law. I met the Assistant General Secretary of the National Union of Teachers at the party conference a year ago. We had a very engaging conversation as I was walking to the conference. I said, this is terrific. It's the first time I've ever had a conversation with anyone from the NUT who wasn't shouting at me with a megaphone across a car park. And when I actually meet trade unionists, they turn out to be almost invariably extremely reasonable people with a really important point to make. And I wouldn't want to feel that they couldn't approach me in any way they wanted to at any time. I obviously take the most notice of the ones who come from my constituency, who are to me much more precious than any other kind of lobbyists. They're the ones who send me to Parliament. My job is to listen to them and to represent them. As far as other kinds of lobbyists are concerned, there will be, I sit on the Public Accounts Committee, so there are lots of National Audit Office reports coming up all the time on every scintilla of government spending in every area, in the utilities, in energy, in telecoms, broadband, water. I remember once, apropos of some big report, the finance director of a big FTSE 100 wanting to come and see me and a colleague to talk about their point of view. And I said, yeah, sure. I mean, and they came, we booked a meeting room, and there may have been water, I can't remember, but there's certainly, it was basically an exchange of information. I found it extremely informative. The thing that you have to do as an MP is filter, because you get so much coming at you, a lot of which is crud and a lot of which is extremely valuable. And sorting out the wheat from the chaff is a very timely process, and there isn't enough time. But the process of trying to influence members of Parliament, whatever you call it, whether you use the word lobbying or not, is a fundamental part of living in a democratic environment. And I don't want to see things done that make that more difficult.
And along with the question of lobbying, it's often raised this question of MPs able to be paid consultancy fees.
Yeah.
Do you approve of that?
Depends what it's for. I wrote a book that came out 2 years ago, Conundrum, Why Every Government Gets Things Wrong and What We Can Do About It, published by Bite Back and available from all good remaining bookshops. Just thought I'd say that for the record. And I got paid for it, not a huge amount of money, I regret to say. I wish it had been a worldwide bestseller, and perhaps after your video it will be. I don't think there's anything illegitimate about that in any way. The book was based on all my experience on the Public Accounts Committee, looking at National Audit Office reports for 14 years, or 12 years as it was then, and trying to distill lessons of where the common problems are that keep on arising and why governments don't learn from their mistakes. Now, do you call that consultancy? It was mostly out of my own head based on the information that was coming to me. If somebody's paying me to advocate for them in a specific direction on a specific issue, that's rather different, I think. And I think one needs.
So, if, for example, you were a former foreign secretary and a Chinese company were offering to pay you for advice, would you think?
Yeah, again, it depends. It depends on the because there may be circumstances where the transaction is perfectly legitimate, and there may be circumstances where most people would look at it and think it was dodgy. And I think you've got to look at the case.
Okay. Tim, you're from a leading city law firm. I'll come to you in a moment, if I may. I just want to ask Tim this question about lobbying. You're from a leading city law firm, and it's often said that the slickest and most discreet and under-the-radar lobbyists are indeed city law firms, who pitch up having nice conversations with members of the House of Commons and House of Lords, apparently sort of having nice general conversations about legislation because they're lawyers, but in fact lobbying hard for some of their rich FTSE 100 clients. Do you do that kind of thing?
Not to my knowledge. Probably because I don't practice in that particular area of the firm, which is probably a weak answer.
That's a pathetic answer, Tim. Do any of your partners do that?
I don't think so. Not in any structured way. I mean, I think they have very strict rules about this sort of thing in America. And we are, of course, an American firm with a London office, or an American firm. I think that the regulations in America would bind us as well, probably. And we would be regarded as being out of step by our American partners if we started carrying out lobbying activities.
Okay, thank you.
I was only going to say that is that there are lobbying firms which are retained, and I think one should know exactly why they're retained, who they're retained by, and what they're being paid. The fact that somebody like a charity or a group, I mean, could be Help the Aged or somebody, they come and have a lobby here. That's nothing. That should be. I mean, we should be open to that. But I don't much care for actual lobbyist firms retained.
I don't understand the necessary distinction, because, I mean, there are charities that employ public affairs consultants to help them lobby. There are public authorities, county councils that employ public affairs firms. I look at them and I think, well, you're not spending taxpayers' money very well, and depending on if I get the chance, I might have a go at them about it. But the world is so complex, and there is so much coming at people, and people who are trying to influence and get their view across to members of parliament, which they're entitled to do, will use all kinds of different methods to do it. I think the issue is if it becomes tainted and the suspicion arises of buying influence rather than simply, as it were, being able to get your view across. And they're two very different things.
In that case, it's the person they're trying to influence. You're looking at that person to see whether they're going to take something, some backhander or something.
Well, I mean,
But
for example, I mean, if a member of parliament receives any money or payment of any kind for anything,
Yes.
it has to be declared.
I know.
And now there's a
I
public
know.
register.
And a number of peers were suspended, as you know. But the main thing which I don't like, and I take your point, it might be difficult to differentiate, is when it's sort of organized in such a way that it's really done by very professional people. I much prefer people to tell me what their problems are. That's perhaps it's me. I like to know what their issues are. And if they need to tell me how the law should be changed, that's helpful. They can get advice on that. They don't much like, I have met many lobbyists, and I have never liked any of them personally because they try to influence me and the way they go about it. But on the other hand, people come to see you, they have problems, they talk to you, that's fine.
So, but presumably it would help the agent that comes to see you.
They come to see me.
But they or whoever, if a
Yes.
charity comes to see you, it's because they would like to see some sort of regulatory or legal change of some kind, and they're hoping you might be able to help them
Usually
achieve
ask
it.
for more money.
I think we'll leave the question there, Camille.
They
We've had a
usually
very
ask
good
for more
airing
money.
for the lobbying issue, and I sense we're not setting a good example to the Commonwealth on lobbying, is my conclusion. Did you have a question? Could you just use the microphone just for the purposes of the video? Thank you.
Well, forgive me after you have just shut down the conversation to bring it right up here. But my name's Nigel Elway. I run Secretariat for your party group on explosive weapons. And 3.5 years ago, when I set up the APPG on landmines, I spoke to a number of organisations, including a couple of pressure groups, who, when they discovered that I was also talking to commercial organisations and government departments, basically said they didn't want to talk to me because they had a particular point of view to get across. These are people purporting to be humanitarian charities, but they are funded for what they do, and I think that actually makes them just as mercenary as the lobbying organisations that work for the commercial sector.
Okay, we'll leave the point there, but thank you. Colin, and could you tell us who you are?
Yes, my name is Colin Nichols. I'm a QC Honorary Life President of the Commonwealth Lawyers Association, and currently in the course of writing the third edition of a substantial book, 900 odd pages, on corruption and misuse of public office. Tim and I, when we're talking with our co-authors about these issues, often ask ourselves, are those of us who are trying to prevent corruption really getting anywhere at all? And as one catastrophe, one scandal follows another, we begin to get rather morose and go to the nearest hostelry. But just coming back to the Commonwealth for a moment, there's no doubt about it that the most active country in the world in trying to prevent corruption is the United States. Whether they're doing it satisfactorily, successfully, or properly is a matter which perhaps we can leave alone. But the point is that they are aggressive. The results, the good results of the work they've done are perfectly obvious. And they are, of course, in the United States has always been extraterritorial in its approach. And so we get the FCPA blogs every day. I noticed, I didn't read it properly, that there was, I think, the first suspicious activity report, failure to provide one, is it Jersey or Guernsey today, something of interest.
Colin, we're nearly out of time, so I'm going to have to hurry.
Sorry. I just want to say this. How do we approach it? There's no doubt in the Commonwealth, there are certain leading countries, Australia, Canada, the UK. Leading countries, developed countries, countries which can exercise a great deal of influence worldwide within the Commonwealth and within their regions. They can have an effect upon what is being done by overseas territories and the smaller territories. And that's really the way I think it has to start. And the work that Transparency International is doing, looking at the situation in the UK as TI UK, focusing on particular issues, particularly at the moment property and beneficial ownership and unexplained wealth orders, maybe, maybe not.
Thank you. I mean, I was just waiting for the plug for TI to come, and finally we've had it, so we can wrap up, almost. In the dying seconds, I'd like to ask each of our panellists, in perhaps 60 seconds, what would your top tips be for the Commonwealth or for the UK in terms of tackling corruption?
Well, to take your example, Colin, of unexplained wealth orders, I think that's an interesting route. We should look at it very seriously. HMRC is becoming much more aggressive in targeting people who appear to have unexplained assets, or assets where the source of the money to pay for them is unexplained, and that's a route that I think we could get much more out of. More broadly, I'm mildly more optimistic than you. I do agree that leading countries such as Canada, Australia and the UK have an important role to play, but I wouldn't underestimate the role of other countries in the Commonwealth taking action themselves. The stories that we've heard this evening about Nigeria, I found tremendously heartening, actually, and those have happened because of a change of government in Nigeria and the determination of that government to rectify wrong and to see right done for the injustice that was done to the Nigerian people when a previous leader stole their own money. And that's the impetus for that is mainly coming from Nigeria. So I'm slightly more optimistic.
Tim, you have just a minute on tackling corruption in the Commonwealth. Your time starts now.
Well, I was also going to make the unexplained wealth order point, because one of the things that really succeeded in the Abacha proceedings was the fact that the Abacha family were classified as a criminal organisation, and that shifted the burden of proof to the Abachas to show how they actually came by the money. And I think this is something which could be extremely usefully used, particularly when dealing with property purchases. Could there be some legislation which would force purchasers to actually disclose where the money has come from to make purchases over a certain amount? If they're spending 10 million on a property, how come you've got 10 million?
Okay, well, unexplained wealth orders could be the future. Thank you very much to both our panellists. Thank you to the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association for laying on this evening. And I think we'll finish with a round of applause.